Welcome back to Fox News. I'm Kaitlyn Collins, and today is March 9th, 2026. We are now entering the ninth day of what has become one of the most significant and volatile conflicts in the modern Middle East, the ongoing war between the United States and Israel against Iran. Before we dive into today's extensive updates, let me give you a quick overview of where things stand. What began as targeted strikes on February 28th has now evolved into a multi-front regional conflict with global implications. In the past 24 hours alone, we've witnessed a new barrage of Iranian missiles lighting up the skies over Tel Aviv, Israeli airstrikes targeting critical fuel infrastructure in Tehran, the formal appointment of Iran's new supreme leader, and perhaps most significantly, the first public disagreement between the United States and Israel over how this war is being conducted. The situation on the ground is extremely fluid. We're seeing military actions across multiple countries, diplomatic tensions between longtime allies, accusations of war crimes being leveled at the highest levels, and economic shockwaves that are being felt in every corner of the globe. Oil prices have skyrocketed past levels not seen since the Ukraine crisis. Stock markets are in turmoil, and millions of civilians across the region are living in fear of what comes next. Our commitment to you, our viewers, is to present this complex situation as clearly and objectively as possible. We will share verified facts from multiple sources, present the perspectives of all parties involved, and help you understand not just what is happening, but why it matters. Whether you're watching from North America, Europe, Asia, or here in the Middle East, we want you to come away from this video with a comprehensive understanding of the day's events. Let's begin with the military situation, because that's where the most dramatic developments have occurred. We're going to spend significant time on the military actions because they've been intense, widespread, and involve multiple countries. Let me break this down systematically by theater. Let's start with Israeli military operations. According to official statements from the Israel Defense Forces, they have conducted another major wave of airstrikes targeting what they describe as regime infrastructure in central Iran. But let me give you more detail about what this actually means. The strikes specifically targeted multiple categories of military infrastructure. First, missile launch sites. These are pre-positioned launch pads and support facilities that Iran uses for its ballistic missile program. Second, a rocket motor production facility in the Isfahan region, which is crucial for manufacturing the propulsion systems for Iran's medium and longer-range missiles. And third, a command and control center that military analysts believe coordinated missile operations across western Iran. Now, here's where things get particularly significant. On Saturday, which was day 8 of the conflict, Israel expanded its targeting criteria significantly. According to multiple sources, including Anadolu Agency and confirmed by satellite imagery, Israeli warplanes struck approximately 30 fuel storage depots in and around Tehran. This represents a major escalation in targeting philosophy. Why is this significant? Because fuel depots, while they can have military applications, are primarily civilian infrastructure. They store heating oil, gasoline, and diesel that ordinary Iranians depend on for their daily lives. The strikes on these facilities caused massive fires. We're talking about explosions that sent thick columns of black smoke thousands of feet into the air, visible across large portions of the capital. These fires burned for hours, in some cases well into the next day. Israeli defense systems were activated to intercept these incoming threats. According to official statements, the Israeli military later announced that it was safe for civilians to leave protected areas nationwide after the interception efforts were completed. However, Channel 12 television reported that debris from interceptor missiles fell in at least 3 locations in central Israel, causing some property damage, but no reported casualties. What kind of missiles is Iran using? According to IRGC statements, they have deployed what they describe as next-generation missiles with improved accuracy and, in some cases, cluster munition warheads. We saw evidence of this on Sunday afternoon, when at least 6 people were injured in central Israel following a ballistic missile attack that appeared to use cluster munitions, weapons that release dozens or hundreds of smaller bomblets over a wide area. Iran has also claimed responsibility for attacking specific strategic targets. One notable claim is that they struck a refinery in Haifa, Israel's third-largest city, in direct retaliation for Israeli strikes on Iranian fuel infrastructure. If confirmed, this would represent a deliberate strategy of tit-for-tat escalation targeting energy facilities. Perhaps most concerning for regional stability is how this conflict has drawn in Iran's neighbors. This is no longer a bilateral conflict. It has become a regional war. Let's start with the Gulf states. Bahrain, which hosts the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, reported that its defense forces intercepted multiple missiles and drones. The Bahraini Interior Ministry went further, announcing injuries from an attack on Bahraini territory. This is significant because Bahrain is a small island nation with limited strategic depth. Even a single successful strike could cause disproportionate damage. In Kuwait, a drone strike hit fuel storage tanks at Kuwait International Airport. The Kuwaiti government has not released detailed casualty figures, but the attack on critical aviation infrastructure represents a new category of target. The United Arab Emirates has taken an interesting stance. Official statements indicate that the UAE considers itself in a state of defense against what it explicitly calls Iranian aggression. This language is carefully chosen. It frames the UAE as a victim of unprovoked attacks rather than as a participant in the conflict, which has important diplomatic implications. Saudi Arabia, the regional heavyweight, has suffered confirmed casualties. The Saudi Civil Defense Agency reported that an unidentified military object, they deliberately avoided specifying whether it was a missile or drone, struck a residential area in the Al-Kharj governorate. The confirmed toll: 2 foreigners killed, 1 Indian national and 1 Bangladeshi national, and 12 others injured. This highlights how the conflict is claiming victims from countries far beyond the immediate region. The situation in Lebanon is particularly concerning because of that country's fragility. Lebanon is already suffering through an economic collapse, political paralysis, and the aftermath of the 2020 Beirut port explosion. Now the health ministry reports that the death toll from clashes with Israel has risen significantly, with over 390 killed. The ministry's breakdown indicates that many of the dead are civilians, though exact figures are difficult to verify independently due to the chaotic situation on the ground. There are also serious concerns about attacks potentially being launched from Lebanese territory. Hezbollah, the powerful Iranian-backed militia and political movement in Lebanon, has a massive rocket arsenal estimated at over 100,000 projectiles. If Hezbollah enters the conflict in a significant way, it would open a northern front for Israel and dramatically expand the war's scope. On Sunday, Iran's Assembly of Experts, a body of 88 clerics constitutionally responsible for selecting the supreme leader, made a momentous decision. They formally named Mojtaba Khamenei as the new supreme leader, succeeding his father Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who was killed in the initial strikes on February 28. Let me give you comprehensive background on who Mojtaba Khamenei actually is, because understanding the man is crucial to understanding where Iran might be heading. Mojtaba was born in 1969 in the holy city of Mashhad, making him 57 years old. He is the second son of Ali Khamenei and has been groomed for leadership for decades, though always behind the scenes. Unlike his father, who held formal positions including president before becoming supreme leader, Mojtaba has never held formal government office. Instead, his influence has been exercised through close personal relationships with senior clerics and, crucially, with the IRGC leadership. This behind-the-scenes role earned him a reputation as his father's gatekeeper, the person who controlled access to the supreme leader and who could make or break political careers. Western intelligence agencies and Iran experts have long described him as effectively a mini-supreme leader, wielding power without the accountability of public office. The United States sanctioned him in 2019 specifically for representing his father in an official capacity, indicating that Washington had long identified him as a key figure in the regime. Now, what kind of leader will he be? I want to share perspectives from multiple experts who have studied him for years. Valeh R. Nasser, a professor of Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins University and a leading expert on Iran and Shiite Islam, told Xinhua News that the choice of Mojtaba represents the choice of continuity with his father. But Nasser added something crucial. He is more ready than other candidates to quickly consolidate power and assert control over the system. This suggests that despite lacking formal experience, Mojtaba has been preparing for this moment for years. Alan Eyre, a former U.S. diplomat who specialized in Iran, offered a more ominous assessment. Eyre told Xinhua that Mojtaba is more hardline than his father, adding that he's going to have a lot of revenge to exact. This is a critical point. Mojtaba's parents were both killed in the initial American-Israeli strikes. The personal dimension of this conflict cannot be overstated. Alex Vitenka, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., offered a strategic perspective. He noted the irony that the United States and Israel carried out a massive military operation, killed an 86-year-old man, and ended up with his hardline son replacing him. Vitenka called it a big humiliation for the United States. The IRGC immediately pledged its loyalty to the new leader in a formal statement. They described the election as marking a new dawn and the beginning of a new phase in the Islamic Revolution and the Islamic Republic. This language is significant. The IRGC sees itself as the guardian of the revolution's ideals, and their swift endorsement suggests that Mojtaba will maintain the hardline, anti-Western orientation of his father. Patrick Lawson, a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, outlined what he expects from Mojtaba's leadership, a strategy of defiant consolidation. This means relying heavily on the IRGC, expanding Iran's missile program, continuing to support regional allies like Hezbollah and the Houthis, and potentially accelerating Iran's nuclear program. Clausen warned that over the medium term, he and the IRGC may decide that Iran must move quickly to obtain nuclear weapons in order to forestall future U.S. and Israeli attacks. The American and Israeli response to Mojtaba's appointment has been remarkably aggressive, even by the standards of this conflict. Before Mojtaba was even formally appointed, Israel issued a chilling threat. An Israeli official stated that whoever Iran chooses as its new supreme leader would be a target for elimination. This is essentially a pre-declared assassination threat against the head of state of another nation. President Donald Trump has been even more direct in his statements. In an interview with Axios before the appointment, Trump declared that having Mojtaba assume the role was unacceptable and made the extraordinary claim that he himself must be personally involved in selecting Iran's next leader. After the appointment, Trump went further. Speaking to ABC News, he stated, "He's going to have to get approval from us. If he doesn't get approval from us, he's not going to last long. We want to make sure that we don't have to go back every 10 years when you don't have a president like me that's not going to do it." Trump also addressed the nuclear dimension, saying, "I don't want people to have to go back in 5 years and have to do the same thing again, or worse, let them have a nuclear weapon." This suggests that preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons remains a core U.S. objective. In a separate interview with the Times of Israel, Trump indicated that ending the war would be a mutual decision between him and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He said, "I think it's mutual a little bit. We've been talking. I'll make a decision at the right time, but everything's going to be taken into account." This phrasing is interesting. Trump acknowledges consultation with Netanyahu, but reserves final authority for himself. Now I want to spend some time on what might be the most significant diplomatic development of the past 24 hours, the first public disagreement between the United States and Israel since the conflict began. According to a detailed report from Axios, cited by multiple news agencies including Anadolu and Yeni Safak, Washington was genuinely surprised by the scale of Israel's strikes on Iranian fuel depots. Let me explain the sequence of events. Israel did notify the United States ahead of the operation. This much is confirmed by U.S. officials. The notification process is standard procedure between close military allies. However, the scope of what Israel actually did exceeded what American officials expected based on those consultations. A senior U.S. official spoke to Axios on condition of anonymity and was remarkably candid. "We don't think it was a good idea." This is unusually direct language for one ally to use about another's military operations in an act of war. Why is Washington concerned? I've identified 3 primary reasons from the reporting. First, there's concern about hitting civilian infrastructure. While the targeted facilities have some military tool, they primarily store fuel for heating, transportation, and daily life. Striking them affects ordinary Iranians directly, which could backfire strategically by strengthening public support for the Iranian government. When civilians suffer, they often rally behind their leadership rather than turning against it. Second, there's concern about global oil prices. A Trump advisor explained, "The president doesn't like the attack on the oil facilities. He wants to save the oil, not burn it. And it reminds people of higher gas prices." This is pure domestic politics. American voters notice when gas prices rise, and they tend to blame the president. Third, there's concern about setting a precedent. An Israeli official described the U.S. message as using very strong words to convey Washington's dismay. The fear is that if Israel can strike fuel depots without U.S. approval, what other targets might they choose unilaterally? An Israeli official offered their perspective, noting that while they understood U.S. concerns, they viewed the fuel depots as legitimate military targets due to their use by Iranian military units. This reflects different threat perceptions. Israel, living much closer to Iran, may feel compelled to take more aggressive action. Now we need to discuss perhaps the most difficult aspect of this conflict, its impact on ordinary people. I want to be extremely careful here, presenting verified information while acknowledging that different parties have different narratives. Iranian officials have provided detailed casualty figures through multiple channels. Let me share these numbers with the important caveat that they come from Iranian government sources and have not been independently verified by international organizations, though some have been corroborated by journalists on the ground. Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, Saeed Iravani, issued a formal statement on Sunday providing comprehensive figures. According to Iravani, since the attacks began on February 28th, at least 1,332 Iranian civilians have been killed and thousands more injured. The Iranian Red Crescent, which operates independently of the government in humanitarian matters, provided additional detail. They reported that approximately 300 of those killed were children. This figure has been particularly impactful in international discussions of the conflict. Iran's Deputy Health Minister Ali Jafarian spoke to Al Jazeera with even more specific breakdowns. He reported that the victims' ages ranged from 8 months to 88 years old, that 200 women are among those killed, and that 55 healthcare workers have been wounded while 11 have been killed, including 4 physicians, 2 nurses, and 3 emergency workers. The most devastating single incident appears to have been the strike on a school in the southern city of Minab. According to the Iranian Red Crescent, at least 165 students and teachers ranging in age from 7 to 12 were killed when a U.S.-Israeli strike hit a primary school. The timing of this strike, during morning hours when school was in session, has drawn particular condemnation from human rights organizations. The Times Now news service, citing Al Jazeera, reported that 168 children were killed in the Minab Elementary School specifically, and that the New York Times has verified video showing a U.S. Tomahawk missile hitting a naval base directly beside the school on February 28. The proximity of military and civilian targets in urban areas is a recurring theme in this conflict. The targeting of infrastructure has been widespread, according to Iranian officials. The Iranian Red Crescent has compiled detailed statistics on what has been damaged or destroyed. 7,943 homes have been targeted. 1,617 commercial sites have been hit. 32 health centers have been damaged, limiting medical capacity when it's most needed. 65 schools have been struck, disrupting education for thousands of children. 13 Red Crescent facilities have been damaged, hampering humanitarian operations. In Tehran specifically, densely populated civilian areas including Engelab Square, Azadi Square, and Nilafar Square have reportedly been bombed. These are not military installations, they are public squares and commercial districts where ordinary Iranians gather. The strikes on fuel depots have created an environmental crisis. Iranian officials report that burning fuel has released toxic materials into the air over Tehran, creating health hazards for millions of residents. Videos on social media show what residents are calling black rain, precipitation mixed with soot and hydrocarbons from the massive fires, staining cars and buildings across the capital. Authorities have warned citizens to stay indoors and avoid exposure to what they describe as toxic fumes. These events have led to formal accusations from the highest levels of the Iranian government. This is not just rhetoric. These are legal claims being made for the historical record and potentially for future international proceedings. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Ismail Baghei issued a statement on Sunday making three specific legal claims. First, he asserted that attacks on fuel storage facilities constitute war crimes. Under international humanitarian law, war crimes include intentional attacks on civilian infrastructure that do not offer a definite military advantage. Second, Baghei claimed these actions amount to crimes against humanity. This is a more serious charge that requires widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population. Baghei specifically argued that by targeting fuel storage tanks, the aggressors are releasing dangerous and toxic materials into the air, poisoning civilians, devastating the environment, and endangering human lives on a large scale. Third, he used the term genocide, though legal experts would note that this charge requires specific intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group, which would be difficult to prove in this context. Baghei wrote on his official X account, "The criminal war by the U.S. and Israel against the Iranian nation has entered a new and dangerous phase with intentional attacks on Iran's energy infrastructure." The Iranian Red Crescent Society has formally condemned the attacks and called for international accountability. Their statement emphasizes that the targeting of civilian infrastructure violates the Geneva Conventions and other instruments of international humanitarian law. I must emphasize that these are allegations being made by the Iranian government. Independent international bodies like the International Criminal Court or the UN Human Rights Council have not yet issued findings on these specific incidents. However, the documentation being compiled by Iranian authorities could form the basis for future legal proceedings. This conflict is not contained to the Middle East. Its economic effects are being felt around the world, and I want to walk you through the details of how this is affecting global markets and everyday people far from the fighting. The most immediate and dramatic economic impact has been on oil prices. Let me give you specific numbers. U.S. crude oil prices surged past the $100 per barrel threshold following the escalation, reaching levels not seen since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Brent crude, the international benchmark, was trading at $114.78 per barrel, while U.S. benchmark crude shot to nearly $114. Both were more than 20% above their closing prices just days earlier. To understand the volatility, consider these figures. Over the past week, U.S. crude soared by 36% while Brent climbed 28%. These are dramatic swings that create uncertainty throughout the global economy. What's driving these price increases? Multiple factors are at work. First, there's the blockade or severe disruption of the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway between Iran and Oman that is one of the world's most critical oil choke points. Approximately 20% of global oil consumption passes through this strait daily. Any disruption here has immediate global consequences. Second, major oil exporters including Iraq, Qatar, Kuwait, and the UAE have been forced to implement production cuts. Kuwait's National Petroleum Company has already announced formal production cuts due to ongoing security threats and shipping disruptions. These are not voluntary OPEC+ decisions. They are forced by the reality of operating in a war zone. Third, there's the threat of further escalation. Iranian military officials have warned that if attacks on Iranian energy infrastructure continue, Tehran could respond by targeting energy facilities across the region. One official warned that if this occurs, global oil prices could surge to $200 per barrel. The oil price shock has triggered turbulence across global financial markets. Let me give you a region-by-region breakdown. In Asia, where markets opened first on Monday, the losses were severe. The Nikkei 225 in Tokyo plunged over 7%, one of its worst single-day drops in years. The South Korean Kospi 200 futures index fell by more than 6%, triggering an automatic halt to program selling, circuit breakers designed to prevent panic selling. European markets faced a parallel sell-off as trading began. Euro Stoxx 50 futures slid 3.2%, German DAX futures dropped the same amount, and UK FTSE futures fell 1.7%. The across-the-board nature of these declines shows that investors see this as a global issue, not a regional one. In the United States, pre-market trading showed notable volatility. S&P 500 futures shed 2.1%, while Nasdaq futures dived 2.5%. Technology stocks, which had been market leaders, were particularly hard hit due to concerns about consumer spending if energy costs rise. What's driving investor fear? Several factors. Higher oil prices lead to higher production costs across virtually every industry. They also contribute to inflation, which could force central banks to keep interest rates higher for longer. And there's growing concern that if the conflict expands to include Saudi or UAE oil facilities, the economic damage could be catastrophic. The conflict is also causing major disruption to travel and transportation across the region. Multiple airlines have canceled flights to countries throughout the Middle East. Turkish Airlines and Pegasus, two of the region's largest carriers, have suspended service to Iraq, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE until at least mid-March. This has stranded thousands of passengers and disrupted business and family travel. The cancellations are creating ripple effects. Aircraft that would normally be in the region are now elsewhere, causing scheduling disruptions globally. Passengers are being rerouted through longer, more expensive alternatives. And there are concerns that if the conflict continues, insurance costs for airlines operating in the region could become prohibitive. Turkey has taken additional defensive measures. The Turkish Defense Ministry announced that it has deployed 6 F-16 fighter jets and air defense systems to northern Cyprus, in light of recent developments in our region. Their statement added that additional measures will continue to be taken based on further developments, if deemed necessary. This shows how even countries not directly involved in the conflict are preparing for potential spillover. Beyond the immediate market reactions, there are longer-term economic implications that deserve attention. For energy-importing nations, this conflict creates serious vulnerabilities. Countries like Turkey, India, and many European nations rely heavily on imported energy. Every dollar increase in oil prices represents a transfer of wealth from these countries to oil producers, potentially straining their economies and currencies. For the United States, higher gas prices are a political vulnerability. American consumers notice when filling up their cars becomes more expensive, and they tend to blame the incumbent president. With midterm elections approaching, this could become a significant political issue. For global economic recovery, the timing could hardly be worse. The world economy was still recovering from the pandemic and dealing with inflation when this conflict erupted. Higher energy prices act like a tax on economic activity, potentially slowing growth just as it was gaining momentum. I want to spend some time analyzing the emerging U.S.-Israel disagreement because it could be strategically significant for how this conflict evolves. The disagreement between Washington and Jerusalem is not about whether to fight Iran. Both sides remain committed to that objective. Rather, it's about how to fight and what the ultimate goals should be. For Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been remarkably consistent in his stated aims. In interviews with Fox News and other outlets, Netanyahu has emphasized that the goal is to create conditions for regime change in Tehran. He has directly encouraged the Iranian people to rise up against their government. For the United States, the stated objectives have been more limited. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has explicitly stated that this is not a regime change war. Instead, he says the U.S. goal is to destroy Iran's missile and naval capabilities while preventing it from acquiring nuclear weapons. A U.S. official familiar with strategic planning put it bluntly, regime change is their goal, not ours. This divergence in ultimate objectives creates tension over tactics, what targets are acceptable, how much risk to take, and when to declare victory and stop fighting. This disagreement is surfacing now because the conflict is entering a new phase. Initial strikes targeted military installations and leadership. But as the conflict continues, the targeting criteria expand, and with expansion comes greater risk of civilian casualties and unintended consequences. The fuel depot strikes represent a threshold. Once you start hitting energy infrastructure, you're affecting civilian populations directly. You're also creating environmental damage and potentially strengthening popular support for the targeted government. There's also a domestic political dimension for both leaders. Netanyahu faces elections in October and is currently trailing in polls. A successful, relatively quick war could boost his standing. A prolonged, costly war could have the opposite effect. Trump, meanwhile, faces midterm elections and constant scrutiny of his foreign policy decisions. Every image of burning fuel depots, every report of civilian casualties, every spike in gas prices becomes political ammunition for his opponents. Analysts have offered varying perspectives on how this dynamic might play out. Dan Shapiro, who served as U.S. ambassador to Israel under President Obama, suggested that Trump might seek to get off the escalator, to declare victory and disengage, even if Netanyahu wants to continue fighting. If Trump concludes that U.S. objectives have been met, he may not be willing to continue supporting Israeli operations indefinitely. Israeli commentator Nadav Eyal wrote in Yedioth Ahronoth that Israel cannot afford to lose American public support. This is more important than destroying any military target. This reflects a deep understanding that Israel's long-term security depends on its alliance with the United States, and anything that strains that alliance carries serious risks. Ophir Shelah, a researcher at Israel's National Security Institute, warned that many Americans already believe Israel's tail is wagging the American dog, that Israel has dragged the U.S. into a war it didn't want. If that perception grows, it could erode the bipartisan support for Israel that has been a cornerstone of U.S. policy for decades. Beyond the direct participants, countries across the region are reacting to and being affected by this conflict. The Arab League Council has issued a formal statement condemning Iranian strikes against member states. The statement specifically named Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait as victims of what it called illegal, unprovoked, and flagrant violations of national sovereignty. This unified Arab response is significant. Historically, the Arab world has been divided on Iran, with some Gulf states viewing it as a primary threat while others maintained diplomatic engagement. This conflict appears to be solidifying Arab opposition to Iranian military actions. Iraq finds itself in an extraordinarily difficult position. It shares borders with both Iran and countries hosting U.S. forces. It has deep political, economic, and religious ties to Iran, but also relies on the United States for security cooperation and economic support. Foreign Minister Fuad Hussein has issued a carefully worded statement urging all parties to cease military operations. More significantly, he stressed that Iraq will not allow its territory to be used for attacks against its neighbors. This is directed at both sides, warning Iran not to launch attacks from Iraqi territory, and warning the U.S. and Israel not to use Iraqi airspace or bases. Turkey, a NATO member with complex relations with both the U.S. and Iran, is watching developments closely. Its deployment of forces to northern Cyprus suggests concern about the conflict expanding into the eastern Mediterranean. Turkey also has significant economic interests at stake. It imports most of its energy, so rising oil prices hurt its economy. It also has extensive trade ties with both Iran and Gulf countries. Ankara is trying to maintain dialogue with all parties while protecting its interests. Before we conclude, I want to highlight two dimensions of this conflict that often receive less attention but have serious long-term implications. The strikes on fuel depots have created an environmental crisis in Tehran and surrounding areas. Burning fuel releases a cocktail of toxic substances including sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, and particulate matter. Officials have warned residents about toxic fumes and advised staying indoors. But for millions of people, staying indoors isn't possible. They need to work, to shop for food, to care for family members. The long-term health effects of exposure to this pollution could be significant. There's also the question of soil and water contamination. Burning fuel creates residues that settle on soil and can wash into water supplies. Agricultural areas around Tehran could be affected, potentially impacting food production. The conflict is creating humanitarian challenges that will persist long after the fighting stops. Health facilities have been damaged at a time when they're most needed. The reported deaths of healthcare workers further reduces capacity to treat the wounded. Displacement is likely increasing, though firm numbers aren't yet available. People flee areas near strikes, seeking safety with relatives or in public shelters. This creates strain on host communities and increases humanitarian needs. This is an extraordinarily complex and rapidly evolving situation. Our commitment at Fox News is to continue providing you with comprehensive, verified, and balanced coverage. We will present the facts as we know them, acknowledge what we don't know, and give voice to perspectives from all sides. If you found this update valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our daily updates as this situation continues to develop. In the comments below, let us know what specific aspects of this conflict you'd like us to explore in greater depth. Are you interested in the military technology being used? The historical background of US-Iran tensions? The impact on specific countries? Your feedback helps us shape our coverage. Thank you for watching and for your commitment to understanding this complex world we share. For Fox News, I'm Caitlin Collins. Please take care of yourselves and each other.